Hi, I'm LGibson, and this is my Networked Learning Project final post and reflection as I think through the process throughout these past few weeks. And so my project was very open-ended, and I chose to learn about making bread. So bread was something that has always intimidated me, given that it is a yeast-based baking project. And so I've always done cakes and I've done other baking and other cooking. And so I wanted to challenge myself. And I was a little bit too open ended. So I thought I could make pretzel bread or focaccia or sourdough and learn the basics of caring for yeast and working with different products to be able to foster different breads. And so I started doing some research, and that first week or so, I was just looking up different breads, watching different videos, and exploring all the different options that were out there. And I was really interested to start off with sourdough. And I viewed a master class and thought, all right, here I go. If I'm going to learn it, I might as well learn it and see what I can do. And so I started watching more videos and looking at more forums. And the more I looked into it, the more in depth and complicated I realized sourdough really is. When I did my Google search, I found 3,120,000 results for sourdough. So there were tons of videos of all different stages and types of sourdough and all the different things that you could do with sourdough. And the more I watched, the more I realized I needed to focus in even further. And so my focus then became learning how to make a sourdough starter, because that's where sourdough comes from. And some people are given this from other family members, or my colleague had some in Raleigh. And so she had always talked about sharing her starter, but starting a starter from scratch seemed easy enough. Simple flour and water, and off you go. So I started looking up and started trying to figure out how to make a sourdough starter. And even from there, I found you could buy it online. I realized that you could have all different recipes, what to do in troubleshooting and not rising. And so some of the big concerns with sourdough starter is your temperature, your oxygen, and the activity of your yeast. I read that you can use all different types of flour to get your starter going, and that different flour has different yeast levels in it. So it was really one of those opportunities to realize the more I knew I didn't know. And so I started pretty simple and read some forums about sourdough starter and some other information about what affects starters. And then I thought the best thing to do would be to get started. So this was my first attempt. I started small because I kept reading that you had to add to it and help it grow and that it would keep expanding. And so I did a little bit of water and a little bit of flour, and it was about a 2-to-1 ratio. And so I measured it out and put it in there, and I used measuring cups. And so that might have been one error that I had starting out. And then in troubleshooting, when it wasn't working, it started separating. I needed to figure out, is it the temperature? I had the lid on the jar, and come to find out it's best to put a tea towel because the yeast still needs to breathe. So there were a lot of different stages of learning that I had throughout this process. And so then I started over and started again and made it a little bit bigger, hoping that if I used the right amount, I went out and bought a kitchen scale and did the measurements based off of grams as opposed to using measuring cups. And so then I added to my starter to really increase it, and then it separated. And so that was really concerning. So then I was reading about it, and turned out one place said that you could just stir it, another place said to start over. So it was kind of conflicting information, and it was hard for me to gauge who the experts really were, given that anybody could post these videos. And some people had starter. One of the master classes I watched, his starter was 9 years old, which was kind of intimidating too. And so then I continued and persevered and finally got some bubbles going. And so that was a sign of yeast life, and it started to smell, which they had said, but you can't really get a grasp of what that smell would be through a video. And so I continued growing and feeding my starter, and now it's getting healthier and healthier. But it has taken quite a few days because they say not to feed it if it's not bubbling and active. So I had to skip a couple days of feeding, and each time you feed it, you cut it back and then add more flour and water. And so this was really a big learning process for me. I don't know that baking is the best way for me to learn through videos. And forums to be able to figure this out. But I do think that it's a great process for certain aspects. It's just important to know which ones are better than others for this process. And so moving forward, I'll continue to grow my starter to continue to grow my knowledge of understanding yeast and other breads.